Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Strange Tales Annual Issue 2 from June of 1963. This issue marks the first appearance of obscure villain Reynard Slinker, otherwise known as the Fox. The issue was written by Stan Lee, drawn by Jack Kirby, inked by Steve Ditko, and lettered by Art Simek. Our story opens up with Sue and Johnny Storm, two siblings better known as the Invisible Girl and the Human Torch of the Fantastic Four. Sue is helping her brother as he completes his daily training routine in the backyard of their Long Island home. Johnny's first training trial is to fly through a large spinning metal contraption, which he completes handily. His second is to pass straight through a tank's stationary treads, which he does without bumping into even a single rivet. Next he dodges blasts of water mid-air, which he stumbles on a bit but passes nonetheless. And finally he manipulates his flame into the shape of a key, which opens a safe. But that Johnny's training is over, and he and Sue head inside to relax for the day. Johnny heads straight for the couch and begins reading a nearby magazine, whose articles are almost entirely devoted to covering New York's newest superhero, Spider-Man. Combing through the magazine and some other recent publications, Johnny finds that they're all fixated on the wall-crawler's heroism and mystique. But the hot-headed hero doesn't seem to be much of a fan of Spider-Man, or at least of all the attention he's getting. Johnny immaturely wonders where's all the publicity that he's owed, as whenever he does something heroic, the credit doesn't go to him, but the entire Fantastic Four. Sue tells her teenage brother to quit his childish tantrum, but this only makes Johnny even more angry. Bursting into furious flame, the Human Torch openly yearns for a chance to show the world that Spider-Man isn't so special. But before we can see any more of the Torch's antics, the issue shifts focus to an art museum in New York City, where two shady figures are discussing an imminent heist. One is just a simple crook, but the other is a criminal mastermind known as the Fox. The crook wonders just how feasible the Fox's plan is, considering that the museum is always teeming with guards. But the confident villain brushes off the concern, as he claims that his scheme is foolproof, even against costumed heroes like the Fantastic Four or Spider-Man. In fact, the Fox declares that the wall-crawler himself will be helping them. So later that night, we see the hands of a workman cut an electrical wire near the museum. But this wire is actually the master line that feeds power to the museum and all other buildings within 3 blocks. Thus inside the gallery are several guards, who are desperately calling for the electric company to send repairmen, as without power the museum's burglar alarms aren't functional. Luckily a trio of repairmen quickly arrive. 2 of these technicians are escorted to the museum's utility room by the guards, but one opts to stay within the gallery and wait for additional equipment to arrive. A short time later the repairmen have restored power, and hurriedly leave soon after. Yet of course these 3 men weren't truly repairmen, but thieves working for the Fox. For as soon as the guards return to the gallery, they find that a priceless painting has been stolen. But they're tricked into blaming Spider-Man, as the Fox's men have planted webbing at the scene. So within an hour, word is spread and newspapers all across the city have published their latest prints, emblazoned with headlines that brand the hero a thief. The issue then shifts focus to Spider-Man himself, who has caught a glimpse of the slandering headlines. Obviously Spider-Man knows he's innocent, but the only way to prove that he's been framed is to catch the real thieves. Yet they were careful criminals, and haven't left him any leads to follow. Realizing he needs help, Spider-Man decides to seek the aid of the Human Torch. Knowing that the Torch lives in Glenville, Long Island, Spider-Man hitches a ride on a passing truck and heads off to find him. Soon enough he does, as the Torch is standing outside his house in full costume. Spider-Man's found the hero just as his sister is leaving their home. Once she's gone, the Torch heads back inside, where he's greeted by a phone call from the chief of police, who asks the hot-headed hero to track down a wanted Spider-Man. The Torch accepts the call to action, but hurriedly hangs up the phone as he hears a noise outside his window. It's Spider-Man, who's come to profess his innocence. But of course the Torch assumes he's a no-good villain, and flies outside to bombard the web slinger with a torrent of fireballs. Spider-Man dodges the attack and tries to reason with the Torch, but the flaming hero is sure that he's come to fight. But of course the wall-crawler hasn't, and leaps into the Torch's pool for cover against his flame. Yet the Torch is eager to battle, and begins heating up the pool with a stream of concentrated heat. But Spider-Man isn't defenseless inside the pool, as he takes the opportunity to craft 2 globs of soggy webbing. He then leaps out of the pool and hurls the first glob at the torch, which knocks the hero off of his feet. Spider-Man then prepares to hurl the second, but the torch has already recovered and has created 4 flaming duplicates of himself to disorient his foe. The torch and his duplicates then lunge at Spider-Man, but they've underestimated the hero's speed and all miss. Yet the web slinger isn't simply dodging out of the way, he's fleeing the scene as fast as he can. He rushes to a nearby construction site, but of course the torch is hot on his trail. Anticipating this, Spider-Man takes a few brief moments to fashion a cement launcher out of a mixer and a pipe. And thus as the torch arrives, Spider-Man activates his trap and completely covers his foe in a thick layer of wet cement. The cement effectively douses the torch's flames, giving Spider-Man an opportunity to escape. But eventually the torch is able to melt away the trap. Yet the intense heat required leaves him exhausted, so he gives up on pursuing his foe and tiredly starts walking home. A few minutes later the torch has made it back to town. Watching him from afar is Spider-Man, who's traveling to a local chemical laboratory that the torch happens to walk past. Sneaking into the laboratory unseen, Spider-Man sets out to create a new webbing that can resist the torch's flames, at least long enough for him to reason with the hothead. So Spider-Man adds ice-cold silicone crystals to his web formula and tests their strength against a powerful hammer blow, which they easily withstand. Armed with these new webs, Spider-Man heads out to find the torch once again. But he doesn't have to look far, as nearby the hero is talking to a group of policemen about motorcycles. Spider-Man announces his presence with a flash of his spider signal and tries to goad the prideful torch into attacking him on a rooftop. By this point the flaming hero has regained his strength and falls for Spider-Man's ploy. But the web slinger isn't there to fight, as he dodges his foe's attacks and leads him out of town and into a trap he's laid. The torch is none the wiser and runs right into an enormous web strung between 2 power lines. The web's infused silicone proves effective against the torch as he struggles to melt through it. With him trapped still, Spider-Man tries to explain that he was framed. But the hothead thinks Spider-Man is just trying to trick him and refuses to believe it. Spider-Man desperately tries once more to convince the torch of his innocence, but the hero still isn't receptive to the claim. It's not until the web slinger frustratingly calls out the torch for his glory-seeking ways that the flaming hero starts to see the humanity under Spider-Man's mask, seeding an inkling of doubt in his mind. But the torch keeps these thoughts to himself, and thus Spider-Man assumes he just can't be convinced. So he leaves the torch stranded on the web to prove his innocence some other way. With Spider-Man gone, the torch musters what he calls cosmic blast intensity and melts his web trap with a flash of blinding light. Now unsure of Spider-Man's innocence, the torch decides to head for the police station and urge them to call off their search, at least until he can find Spider-Man and figure out the truth. The torch arrives in the office of the deputy police inspector, who tells him that Spider-Man has stolen yet another painting, this time only a half hour earlier. But of course the torch was battling Spider-Man at the time of the theft, confirming in his mind that the hero really is innocent. The torch thus tells the inspector that Spider-Man's been framed, an idea the policeman's receptive to. So the inspector begins searching through a collection of known criminal profiles to see if any of their MOs fit the crime. Sure enough, he stumbles onto the profile of Reynard Slinker, otherwise known as the Fox. The inspector realizes that the Fox is likely the mastermind behind the stolen paintings and thus agrees to halt his department search for Spider-Man. The torch then races out of the inspector's office and emblazons the sky with a fiery message for the hero, asking to team up with him. But the message is hardly conspicuous, and the Fox and his men see it from afar. Knowing that they can't handle the two heroes working together, the villain decides that it's time for him and his men to skip town while they're still ahead. But along with the Fox and many others, the message is also read by its intended target Spider-Man. He travels to the top of the Statue of Liberty and uses its beacon to brightly reflect his spider signal, which the torch sees from across the city. So the flaming hero travels to the statue and greets Spider-Man atop its head. No ill feelings are held between the two former foes, as the torch tells Spider-Man that the Fox is the one who framed him. Luckily the inspector provided the torch with a photo of the Fox and a list of his last known locations, the first of which is a subway station. So that's where the two heroes head first. But while Spider-Man is inside the station searching for the villain, he's flagged down by an old lady carrying a heavy bag. She asks the friendly neighborhood hero to hold the bag for her while she retrieves some subway tokens. Naturally, Spider-Man is happy to help and takes the bag off of the woman's hands. But suddenly it starts secreting a sticky superglue that traps his arms still. Shockingly, the old lady was actually the Fox in disguise, and he's now pulled out a revolver to end Spider-Man. But just as the villain is about to shoot, the Torch arrives and releases a stream of concentrated heat that destroys the weapon. He then turns his attention to melting away the glue on Spider-Man's arms, giving the Fox time to escape into a subway tunnel. After a few moments of delicate melting, an unstuck Spider-Man and the Human Torch race after the villain. But the heroes are almost hit by an incoming train car on their way down the tunnel. The Torch sees it coming sooner than Spider-Man and warns the nimble hero as he flies above its path. Thus Spider-Man quickly drops to the ground, low enough that the train passes harmlessly above him. Yet face down on the tracks, Spider-Man notices something odd. Looking closely, he discovers a hidden trapdoor, which he and the Torch hurriedly enter. But despite finding his hidden lair, the Fox is nowhere to be found. So the heroes need to start their search from scratch and decide to first head to the seediest neighborhood in New York. There, Spider-Man senses pick-up danger at the sight of a wooden Native American statue advertising cigars. But it's not the statue itself that's suspicious, but what lies underneath it. So Spider-Man raises up the figure and finds another hidden passage. But this time the secret lair isn't empty, as an automatic rifle suddenly springs out of the passageway and begins shooting wildly at the heroes. Luckily both are able to dodge its hail of bullets and force their way into the lair. Inside, Spider-Man and the Torch quickly subdue two of the Fox's henchmen, who reveal that the villains already abandoned them and fled for Central Park with the stolen painting in tow. Thus the two heroes race to the park, and arriving there, Spider-Man senses the presence of a third secret lair, this time hidden underneath a water fountain. Once again it's empty, but Spider-Man discovers a second hidden exit within. Traveling through, he and the Torch open a trapdoor disguised as the ground itself and emerge behind an odd-looking man who's wheeling around an oversized telescope. A policeman approaches the man and tells him that he needs a license to use the gadget in the park, which the man doesn't have, so he agrees to leave. Yet as he is, Spider-Man and the Torch spring up from the trapdoor and order the man to stop. But he ignores the order and instead activates hidden rocket jets within his shoes. Blasting away from the heroes, the man starts zipping through Central Park in an epic escape. But just like the Human Torch before him, the man has underestimated Spider-Man's speed, as the hero amazingly catches up to him and stops him dead in his tracks. Thus the web slinger exposes the man for who he really is, the Fox wearing a mask. The Torch catches up to Spider-Man carrying the villain's telescope and discovers that rolled up inside is the stolen painting. With that, the issue subsequently ends as the Torch and Spider-Man walk the Fox away to the authorities and playfully jab at each other's contributions to the villain's downfall. That concludes the Spider-Man Human Torch story of Strange Tales Annual Issue 2 and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a solid if predictable story. The action was fun and the dialogue witty, but the story stuck a little too close to the standard hero versus hero formula. That being when two heroes find themselves in a misunderstanding. Briefly battle. Realize there's a hidden villain orchestrating their actions. And then team up to defeat them. Speaking of villains, the Fox was a pretty forgettable foe, but I do appreciate when stories take more eccentric heroes like Spider-Man or the Human Torch and pit them against crime bosses and other seedy underworld villains. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.